think we've still got 1 or 2 minutes, so we'll just wait and see if anyone else shows up in the next 60 seconds or so. All right, let's get started. Hi, my name is Alexander Freed, and welcome to Creating Star Wars Stories. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you to the folks at Liburnicon for bringing me out here. It is really a huge privilege to get to talk to all of you and to be at this sort of amazing festival. So yes, 1,000 thank yous. I can only hope to keep you all interested for the next 45 minutes or so. That's how long the presentation will take, and then we will open it up to questions after that. Yeah. All right, good, that's working. So this presentation is essentially an insider's view of what it means to create a new story in the Star Wars universe. We're going to sort of dissect Star Wars as a storytelling tool. We're going to talk about how what audiences expect from a Star Wars story and how to address those expectations. We're going to talk about sort of trying to innovate and do new things with a Star Wars story while still relying on what makes it familiar and what makes people love it in the first place. We'll also talk a little bit about the differences between making a Star Wars story for a video game versus a novel versus a movie versus etc. That should take up our time pretty well. I should emphasize at this point, I do not work for Disney, I do not work for Lucasfilm. This is all my personal thought process and sort of how I have related to Star Wars over the years, but it is informed by my experience, which brings us to who am I? I've done a lot of stuff over the years. I've done a lot of video games and comics and other stuff that we don't care about. What we do care about is Star Wars stuff. So I've written a lot of Star Wars things over the years. I was lead writer on BioWare's Star Wars The Old Republic video game. I did a few other video games as well. I wrote a bunch of Star Wars comics. And I wrote the Star Wars Battlefront Twilight Company novel that came out in 2015. And I also wrote the novelization of of Rogue One. So I've been around this a while, and hopefully my experience is at least somewhat useful for thinking and discussing all of this. Need to not put this down. So, the challenge of doing a new Star Wars story. Everyone loves Star Wars, and that is fantastic, right? It means that when I get to write a Star Wars story, I get to speak to so many fans out there, and I get to use Star Wars as a way to reach them and communicate with them and tell new stories. And that is absolutely wonderful. But it's also a huge responsibility because everyone who's buying something with the name Star Wars on it has a certain set of hopes and expectations attached to that story. So, you know, what do people want when they're picking up something Star Wars? And as a writer, you know, I'm faced with the question of, okay, how do I give these Star Wars fans something that is really going to connect with them? And to figure that out, what I have sort of come to realize is I need to figure out what Star Wars means. What is the baseline that we are using to compare anything else Star Wars against? And to answer that, we need to talk about sort of a canon. And when I say canon, I don't mean continuity necessarily. What I mean there is, what is the set of works that almost all Star Wars fans agree on that this is what Star Wars is. This is absolutely true Star Wars, and everyone knows it, right? It's something that everyone just immediately recognizes. And the only thing that really fits that definition is the original trilogy. The original movies, that's what defines Star Wars more than anything else in the popular imagination. Everyone knows who Darth Vader is. Everyone knows who Yoda is. The original films don't have to be your favorite. You don't have to think that they're the best, but they're the ones that you can pull a random person off the street and ask them, what their favorite scene in Return of the Jedi is, and they will probably have an answer. Which means that, yeah, that's your touchstone. That's what you end up going back to. You cannot escape the influence of those original films. Whoops, I wasn't ready to go there yet. If you compare those original films to, say, the prequel trilogy, a lot of people love the prequel trilogy, a lot of people don't, but a lot fewer people have seen it and have strong emotional reactions to it. A lot more people out there know what a Wookiee is than know what a Padawan is. You can ask them those questions, and yes, hardcore fans are absolutely going to know all that, but it's not going to connect with the wider audience quite the same way. That doesn't mean that you can't use that material, you just can't rely on it. Same goes for some of the novels. So I imagine there are some people in this room who really fell in love with Star Wars, not from the original films, but from the Timothy Zahn novels from the 1990s, where, there hadn't been any new Star Wars material for a number of years, and then these new books started coming out, and they started telling a new story. And that is wonderful. That is fantastic. And there is a reason why we see characters like Admiral Thrawn from those books coming back in the Rebels cartoon and coming back in a comic and a novel, right? People do recognize those characters. But again, compared to the number of people who have seen those original films, it's a much smaller number. So yeah, the non-film canon can be useful to draw from as a writer, as a resource, but it's not what you point at and you say, that's Star Wars, I want to be like that. Finally, there is the new stuff. Episode 7, Rogue One, episode 8 and 9 on the way, and all the other new films on the way. How that's going to end up fitting into the popular consciousness, I think, is going to be really interesting to see. But we don't really know yet. We've had 40 years to digest the impact of A New Hope on popular culture. So for me, when I'm writing Star Wars, it always feels premature to look to the new films as, all right, I want to be like this. For the moment, I feel like the new films are still looking back at those originals and trying to do new stuff and innovate from there. And we'll talk a little more about that later. Yeah. So coming back to the original trilogy, if you ask anyone, does A New Hope feel like Star Wars, the obvious answer is yes. That's obvious, but it's a good starting point for us to discuss, all right, so if that's Star Wars, why does that feel like Star Wars? What about it is important? That is a load of Star Wars stuff. All sorts of fun things from the original trilogy there. But if your definition of what makes a great and influential and meaningful Star Wars story is any story with that stuff in it, you can very easily end up with something fairly disappointing. I can't just write anything with a stormtrooper and a lightsaber and Yoda. And yes, it'll look kind of like Star Wars, but it may not actually have any real impact in anyone's lives. They're not going to remember that. I am trying to turn a page of my notes, and I can't do this. There we go. So yeah, so if that's not what makes Star Wars, what is it? Again, this is all personal opinion. This is what I look to Star Wars for and how I dissect it and try to create my own baseline. So starting with, what are the big themes? What are the big sort of meaningful, overarching ideas that go through those original movies that we want to carry over into new stories? For me, the first one is family, right? And family can be blood, right? It's Luke and Vader and Leia, but it's also relationships that might as well be family. So Obi-Wan really is like a father to Luke in many ways. He looks up to that man as his paternal figure. Han and Luke have this very kind of older brother, younger brother relationship between themselves. Pretty much every character in the original trilogy that we see much of at all, they've got that kind of family bond. There aren't a lot of sort of work-friend relationships in those original movies. There aren't a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I see him every day. Yeah, we fight in the rebellion together. It's cool. Right? Like, they are all intense relationships that even if they're not literally family, they feel like family. Good and evil. A little obvious, but it's really important in the Star Wars universe, I feel. Again, when I'm trying to create a new Star Wars story, recognizing that there is absolute good in the form of the Force and the way that it guides people, and there is absolute evil in the form of the dark side and the Emperor and the Sith. And there is a lot of area in between, right? So Han Solo, when we first meet him in A New Hope, and he is, this kind of sleazy guy in a bar who apparently has abandoned his passengers in the past. Like, he's done some shady stuff, and it is not at all clear, is he going to be a good guy in the end? There is plenty of room for moral grays inside the Star Wars universe, but there is also good and evil. And for me, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about the setting, is that you can have good and evil, but not everyone needs to be at those extremes. Yeah, I mean, I've written quite a few stories where, stormtroopers or Imperials are main characters, and they can be really interesting main characters, and they, again, don't need to be absolute good and evil. But even if people working for the Empire aren't absolutely evil, the Emperor still is. And if you write a Star Wars story where you're like, well, maybe the Emperor wasn't so bad after all, like maybe he had some good ideas, that's probably not going to feel like the Star Wars that most of us know and love. Next up, epic stakes. So Star Wars is, a struggle on a cosmic scale with massive battles and, struggles for the fates of entire planets. And that's all great, right? Like, that is epic. But it also doesn't have to be epic on sort of a physical scale. So if you look at the start of Return of the Jedi, that whole first third of the movie, it is essentially about Luke risking his life and all of his friends risking their lives just in order to save, hey, I just got a little extra power on the microphone. Risking their lives in order to save Han Solo. And the fate of Han Solo doesn't really matter to the rest of the galaxy. They're just doing it because this man is part of their family, because they love this man. They could go off and battle the Death Star and kill the Emperor without him. But for them, this is a life and death struggle. And that's what epic stakes means to me, is that the stakes are incredibly high for everyone involved, even if they aren't high for the entire galaxy. Sense of wonder. So this is one of the hardest things to imitate from the original films. Those movies are full of just moments of discovery, moments of sort of childish wonder when the characters and the audience just see something that is strange and new for the first time. You think about that very first shot of A New Hope, where you see the Star Destroyer sort of slowly crawling over the tiny little rebel ship. And it's just massive, and you've never seen anything like it before. Or you think about when Luke walks into the Mos Eisley Cantina for the first time, and you just get table after table after table of weird aliens. And those aliens, they're not important to the plot. They don't necessarily turn up again. They're just there to sort of emphasize, look how big and strange this galaxy is. There's more of that as Luke is learning the Force. Think about when Luke uses telekinesis for the first time in The Empire Strikes Back, when he pulls his lightsaber out of the snow. Just all of these moments of awe and wonder, I think, are incredibly important to making something feel like a Star Wars story. Those are sort of the four biggest themes that stand out to me. Theme is really only one part of a story, though. You could do a lot of different kinds of stories with these particular themes. That doesn't, on its own, make it Star Wars. So let's move on to plot and setting. So what elements of plot, what elements of setting are absolutely iconic to Star Wars? Again, this is my sort of personal list when I'm building a new Star Wars story and I'm going, all right, what do I need to look at in order to make sure that I'm not just doing my story? What do I look at to make sure I'm doing a Star Wars story? The Force. So obviously the Force. But the Force also embodies several of those themes that we were just talking about. The Force pulls along with it family, right? The Force runs strong in families, or it doesn't run strong in families, right? But it's carried by blood. The Force hits home on those good and evil aspects that we talked about. The Force has sense of wonder. So even Star Wars stories which aren't about the Force, which aren't about Force users, they generally at least acknowledge the existence of the Force and what it means to that universe. If you're doing a story without the Force, then you're noticing that lack of Force. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's done in Rogue One, a few slides down the line. So I say the Force. I don't have Jedi and Sith on this list. They are important elements of the background, but the Jedi aren't really a presence in the original trilogy. The idea of the Jedi are important. But we only ever see Obi-Wan, and otherwise it's just sort of an ideal that Luke wants to live up to. The Sith aren't even named in those original films. The idea that there are evil people who use the Force, that's important. And there's a wonderful and rich mythology around the Jedi and the Sith, and you can use that in stories and bring it to light, but you don't want to lean on those the way you want to lean on the Force and make it one of the sort of fundamental structural elements of your story. War. It's in the name. I'll flag it anyway. Star Wars is not, by and large, a setting in which everything is successfully resolved by diplomacy. Everyone tries diplomacy, but you expect some sort of large-scale battles in a Star Wars story. Fantastic locations. This ties pretty strongly into the sense of wonder aspect that I was talking about before. I don't need to see Tatooine in every Star Wars story. I don't need to see Hoth in every Star Wars story. But I do need to see some environment that really stands out as its own amazing science fictional world. And specific characters, right? Han Solo, Yoda, Luke. You don't need them in every Star Wars story, but boy, do they help a lot to make it feel like Star Wars. And the reason I even say that is because if you don't have those characters in your Star Wars story, then you may need to lean on some of these other aspects more. You don't need all of these things in every Star Wars story, but you need to understand that when you remove one, you need to find an alternative means of support. Background props. I just liked that picture. So, you know, the little stuff, the TIE fighters, the stormtroopers, the sound that a lightsaber makes when you move it back and forth. Yes, that exact sound. The fact that they are droids and not robots, right? All of these things, all of these little background elements help to add a sense that, yes, this is the same world that we see in the movies. You can't build a convincing Star Wars story without at least some of them. You can absolutely do it without all of them, but you can't go wrong on them. You want them in there. They are the spices in your Star Wars stew. So all the themes that we talked about, the setting elements, the background props, this doesn't give you a good story. This just gives you a story that is going to feel kind of Star Wars-ish. Again, you don't need all of them, but you want at least some of them in order to ground yourself on that. We're going to get to more about sort of where the strength of the story actually comes from, but that is your foundation from which you are going to build everything else. Or, for me, yes, when I'm writing a new Star Wars novel or working on a plot for a video game, you know, I try to keep those elements in my mind and go, okay, so everything else on top of that, that's all going to be important, but this is where we start. So, taking Rogue One as an example, on the surface, Rogue One does not look like the most traditional Star Wars story in the world, but it still uses those themes that we were talking about, even though, you know, it doesn't have any Jedi, even though it's a lot grimmer than we're used to for Star Wars. So we've got family with Jyn and her father and the growing bond between Jyn and her team. We've got mysticism and, you know, the Force in the form of Jeddah, right? Like, this is a planet that is just, we don't see Jedi and Sith, you know, throwing people in the air on Jeddah, but the existence of the Force is immensely important in this story and in the character of Chirrut. And the absence of the Force, the fact that none of these characters have that natural power with them, that gives the story a certain feel of desperation and hopelessness, because we know the Force is important in the Star Wars universe. High stakes, Fate of the Rebellion, pretty easy. Good versus evil, the Rebel Dream versus the Death Star. And sense of wonder is in there as well, right? We are constantly seeing strange and new things in Rogue One. So, whether or not you like Rogue One, again, some people are fans, some people aren't, but you can tell that the creators wanted this to feel like a Star Wars story by going back to those essential elements that we talked about. All right, so once you've figured out how to identify what makes a Star Wars story feel Star Wars-y, how do you go beyond those elements and figure out something new and different and exciting? Because when you're reading a Star Wars book or comic book or playing a video game or whatever form you're experiencing it in, I can't talk. You want something that is familiar and you want something that feels like Star Wars, but you also want something new. If you didn't want something new, you could just watch your DVDs, right? There's plenty of Star Wars material out there if you don't want every story to be a little bit different. You don't want to do you don't want to read or watch something that just feels like a complete rehash. And it's easy as a creator to fall into the trap of looking too close at the step-by-step moments and characters of those original films and just trying to recreate them. You can end up with sort of new characters in familiar roles, so sometimes that's okay. I'm sure, again, in this room, someone is a fan of Dash Rendar and knows what that reference means. But just as often, if you try to do that, you just get sort of a shadow of the original material without the real heart behind it. So let's talk about a few ways of moving beyond that baseline without just recreating or mimicking the originals. So, fresh inspiration. No story can feed entirely on itself, so you always want to look at the world around you, look at what's happening, what's relevant to you, what's relevant to your personal experience, to bring them into a new story. Rogue One is, in its way, a Star Wars war story. Star Wars novels have done horror stories and even medical dramas. There was a series of MedStar novels about 10 years back. So, there are ways of bringing outside elements into Star Wars. But I also find it useful to look back at some of the original influences on Star Wars. What was George Lucas reading and watching that made him come up with this stuff? And you look at samurai films and old sort of pulp space operas and westerns. And I think it's really interesting to go back to that original material and see, have we, over the years, as we do sort of Star Wars and then Star Wars-derived stuff, and we get further and more steps away from that origin, is there stuff that we lost during that transition? Is there something that we can learn from those 1930s space opera novels that we've really sort of forgotten about when we've just been thinking about Star Wars? Conversely, what has been done that is new in those genres in the last 40 years, right? Westerns and space operas and samurai films are not exactly like they were back in the 1970s. So is there stuff that we can look at and then fold back into Star Wars so that we're not trying to evolve the entire franchise and medium just in this one narrow way? Incremental change. So every time a Star Wars story introduces a new theme into the mix or a new idea, it kind of becomes fair game for later writers. So, for example, the Clone Wars cartoon, that was kind of our first place telling Star Wars military stories. And they did it gradually, right? Like they introduced clones as actual sort of human beings and real characters. And suddenly we were watching them fight and we cared about them and we cared about their team dynamics. And yeah, we were watching military stories and they weren't just cannon fodder anymore. You can look at the original Dark Horse Comics Tales of the Jedi comic books from the early to mid 1990s. And they were sort of the first big Star Wars story that featured an entirely different era. So they took place thousands of years before the original trilogy. And that opened the door to video games like Knights of the Old Republic, comic books like Star Wars Legacy. Suddenly, doing stuff in a new era wasn't so strange and risky anymore. So there are ways to incrementally change the toolbox to expand what you can do, but the downside of that is every time you do that, you're reducing your audience size. So again, we talked a little about the Thrawn novels at the start, and the existence of, or I'm sorry, the Timothy Zahn novels, and now we've got Thrawn in Rebels, we've got Thrawn in comics, and that's again fantastic. But you can only go so far in that way. There's a reason we had Thrawn sort of totally reintroduced, and we're not getting a novel about the internal politics of his people, right? Because there just aren't enough people who would recognize that. So you need to be careful if you're getting more and more limited to the hardcore fans who have read every single comic book up until a given point. Go big or go small. Again, I'm trying to flip the page on my notes here. So there are kind of two real opportunities where a writer can take a big risk with a Star Wars story and do something distinctly different. And if no one is reading or watching or playing your thing, you can get away with a lot. If you're putting out a single 22-page comic book, well, if it's a little weird and a little risky and a little un-Star Warsy, you can probably get away with that and see how the audience is going to react. If it doesn't work, not that many people are going to be upset. The alternative is you can go so big that the audience kind of has to buy into it or not. And I think a really interesting example of that one is the prequels. So you can look at the prequels, and they try to do so many things that we don't associate with the traditional Star Wars story. So there is a child protagonist in Phantom Menace. There is a whole political plot line. There are a lot of elements that we just don't think of as traditionally part of the franchise, but George Lucas was doing them, and George Lucas, he could do whatever he wanted with Star Wars, and good for him, right? Like, he could declare Star Wars to be anything he wanted, and as the audience, you either buy into that or not. The rest of us who aren't George Lucas and who have to sort of work within that framework, we don't get that excuse. I can't declare like, well, I'm better than George Lucas. I'm going to do something totally different than Star Wars. No one here is going to buy into that. So it's really only sort of the absolute biggest things where you can really get away with doing something wildly risky. Excuse me a moment. All right, next slide. What is next? Star Wars across media. So we've talked a lot about the discrete elements of Star Wars stories and how to move beyond the baseline. But let's talk a little about the strengths and weaknesses of these 5 different media. So we're going to cover films, television, comics, novels, and video games. We are not going to radio plays or other relatively obscure phenomena, although that would be awesome if we had the time. Films. So, films are obviously sort of the native medium for Star Wars. This is what Star Wars was built for. We've got giant spectacle, we've got action, we've got, clear character archetypes as portrayed by talented actors. Weaknesses of film, they're really short. There's only so much story that you can fit into 2 hours. And that limits a lot what you can do with a character, with explaining the background of the universe and the way everything works and where all this comes from. So it limits your complexity a lot. A film needs to be focused on doing a few things incredibly well, and then the rest of it, in order for the film to work, needs to end up on the cutting room floor. Television. Television can't do big budget action and sense of wonder as well as film can. But what it can do is it can do long-term character arcs and world building in a way that films really can't. Again, if you look at the Clone Wars TV show or the Rebels cartoon, some of the most interesting stuff is the slow evolution of the protagonists. We get to see Ahsoka Tano go from kind of, young and impetuous and, a little obnoxious and thinks too much of herself to really becoming this very mature Jedi by the end of the Clone Wars, and then coming back in Rebel and being this almost cynical leader, right? And we get to see every single step of that done in a way that we don't get for Luke's journey. Luke's journey that we see in the films, we see the most important moments, and then we see the next most important moment, but we don't see every step along the way in there, which can be really interesting from a storytelling perspective. And of course, in terms of background, world building, again, Rebels, for example, gives us a sense of what life under the Empire is like in a way that we really don't get anywhere else. We get to see what life is like for an average merchant, and we get to spend a lot of time on the same planets over and over again and see how it affects the people who live there. Comics. Comic books are kind of interesting in that they can do visual spectacle almost better than films can. In a comic book, you can have 22 pages of vastly different alien landscapes and races and crazy stuff that would be just prohibitively expensive for a film to do. And for a comic book, I can ask an artist to fill 22 pages of strange alien landscapes, and it takes just as much time and effort for that artist to do it as it would to do 22 pages of 2 Earthlings standing around and talking in their garage, right? The pages need to be drawn either way. So comics have the advantage of just doing these wondrous visuals that you can't do anywhere else. You've got the same sort of long-term character arc potential as you do in television. When it comes to action, comics are great at doing certain sorts of action. We're used to that in superhero comic books. Comics do movement really badly. So the example that people like to give for this one is car chases. A car moving incredibly fast on a road in a comic book looks pretty much the same as a car sitting still in the middle of the road. And there are things you can do to, you can put speed lines around it, you can play with it, but it doesn't come across that well, and that's going to be true in Star Wars as well for space battles between X-Wings and Star Destroyers, right? It's really hard to get that sense of the X-Wings swooping around. It's hard to do pod racing and speeder racing, and right, so you need to be careful to do the right action story in a comic book rather than playing to all the wrong aspects. Novels. I love novels. Novels and short stories are better at anything than for getting inside the head of a character, getting into their emotions, getting into what it's like to feel the Force. A novel also has the space to go in depth about world building and background. I can do 3 pages of how does the Death Star work. If you took 5 minutes to do that in a film, it would grind it to a halt. It would be awful. But novels are also the weakest for doing action scenes, right? For obvious reasons. They don't have the same punch of visceral wonder that seeing an alien landscape gives you. You can write it out in 4 paragraphs, but that doesn't have the immediacy. And for those reasons, I would say of the 5 different media we're discussing, novels are almost the least natural way to tell a Star Wars story. Again, I love novels. That doesn't mean you can't tell an amazing Star Wars story in a novel, but it means you've got a different set of challenges and a pretty high set of bars to clear when you're dealing with that. Last medium, video games. I'm a little biased. I do a lot of work in video games, but I think video games have at least the potential to be a very solid match for what Star Wars is built to do. So you've got the same sort of potential for visceral action as you do in film, only you've got an actual player involved in it. You've got video games that can take 20, 40, 60 hours to play, so you've got space for character development and world building that you don't necessarily have in a film. You've got, the big spectacle, right? You can't do it quite the degree that comics can, but you can build crazy alien environments in a video game. Now, does every video game succeed at these things? No, a lot of video games just aren't good. But they're not good because of their Star Wars-ness. They're not good because of other problems. So I do think that they're a very strong, natural match for the franchise. So when you break down the different media like this, it should be fairly clear that there are certain stories that you want to tell in one medium that you don't want to tell in another. If I'm writing a novel, I can do a story about what it feels like to use the Force and the inner turmoil of a Jedi and how it affects her experience using the dark side or starting to fall. You can get into what the Force feels like in the way a film can't. If I'm doing a comic book, I can constantly introduce new visuals. So getting towards the end here, fan expectations and playing favorites. I'm going to sidetrack a little bit here and talk about, most of us have some weird little bit of Star Wars that we really love, and maybe not everyone else does. I actually think that Gungan culture is kind of interesting. No one else thinks this. It's just me. But I'm always tempted. Hey, is there a place that I can put this in? Maybe for you it's something in an old West End Games role-playing game book, right? Like we all have little bits that connect with us in a special way. All of that is fine, but it's very easy to get involved in playing favorites so that you lose sight of the bigger picture. ultimately, you're not here to just play with toys in the sandbox. If you're trying to make a new Star Wars story, you're here to do something that is going to have an appeal to a large number of people who love this franchise, and you need to do what's best for the story, whether or not you are, fulfilling all of, playing with all of the action figures that you really want to do. So there is a fight against temptations, for me at least, where I go, well, am I doing this because it's good for the story, or am I doing this because I think Gungans are really cool? All that said, getting to the very end here, concrete example, I'm going to use my novel Twilight Company as a quick example. I'm assuming most of you have not read it. That is fine. So the point of Twilight Company was to do a tie-in to the Battlefront video game, but Lucasfilm and Del Rey Books did not have a lot of specifics of what they want. So they wanted a book that felt military in spirit. They wanted something that captured the large-scale battles of the game and went to some of the same locations. But otherwise, I was pretty free to do whatever felt right to me as a Star Wars Battlefront book. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a book that felt like the story of all the background soldiers that we see in the films, right? Like something that tells the story of the people running around on Yavin Base or running around on Hoth. I wanted to do something that felt like a military story but was still undeniably Star Wars. So the main character, he comes from a backwater world. He's kind of a cynical sergeant. But he's from a planet that really is too far out to have a lot of technology of its own. They've seen blasters. They know what they are, but they can't name all the alien races in the galaxy. They've never been on Star Destroyers. So for this main character, although he's not naive and heroic in the way that Luke is, he shares Luke's inexperience with the galaxy. So, when he walks into a cantina and, he's seeing alien races, they're new to him, and hopefully that evokes some of that sense of wonder for the reader. Again, War and Epic Stakes, it's trying to capture the sense of these background soldiers from the film. So one of the big moments of inspiration for me was in the Battle of Hoth. You see those walkers coming, and you see one little rebel running along who just gets shot by one of the walkers. And I wanted to tell that guy's story, right? It's not about specifically that character, but I wanted to evoke that sense from the movies and tie it back to the movies in that way. Whether I succeeded or not in making a Twilight Company feel like a military science fiction novel that was also a Star Wars novel, you can debate that. You can debate whether the book is any good. That's fine. But for me, it was a Star Wars story that I hadn't seen done before, and it had to be a Star Wars story in order to tell it. And that kind of gets at something that I've been talking around this whole presentation. A great Star Wars story has to have something to say, and it needs to use Star Wars in order to say it best. A story that's, just Star Destroyers and Jedi, but doesn't mean anything, that's not going to make the audience care. That's not what you're coming to Star Wars for. That's not what made you fall in love with the franchise in the first place. It was the deeper meaning and the themes behind these stories that connected with you on a deeper level. And that's why, for me, it's so important to understand how and why Star Wars touched people in the first place, and try to evoke that in some ways. Star Wars offers a path to people's hearts, and you want to use that for a good purpose. there aren't any rules to how to do this. There's no secret formula. And good writing is ultimately good writing. You can write a good story that's a bad Star Wars story, and that's probably better than doing a good Star Wars story that's just badly written. You don't want either of those scenarios, though. Either way, you're going to disappoint the audience. And we have 40 years of novels and comics and films and games and so forth to draw from. We have so much we can learn from. And that can make it hard to express something new, but it also gives us so much to draw from and experiments to learn from. And so long as we keep learning from those last 40 years of Star Wars history and pushing the franchise forward, we should have new and meaningful stories for a long time to come. And that is it. So yeah, we're going to have some time for Q&A. Do we? Do we need to shift into the?
Before we start with the questions, the Association Kulturny Front would like to thank you for participating in this year's Liburnicon.
Thank you. All right, so yeah, we've got time for questions. Feel free to throw whatever you've got at me. Yeah, and I'll be around. So if we can't get through everything, just we'll wander out and we'll chat more.
I have a question. Thank you. I would like to ask you, on your presentation there was about video games and it said strengths and weaknesses, and interactivity was both a strength and a weakness. And I know you had to rush things, but can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked that because, like I said, I work a lot in video games, so I've got some strong opinions on this. Interactivity is a wonderful tool for getting the player incredibly involved in the story and having a stake in the story and really sort of getting an intimate sight of it the way that they wouldn't otherwise. Interactivity also limits the number of stories that you can tell pretty dramatically, because when you move into that tight perspective that is just the player's experience, a lot of traditional tricks of storytelling don't work as well. I suddenly care a lot less about seeing things from the villain's perspective because I'm living the story rather than watching it as an observer. So it just, yeah, there are a lot of constraints, even though it gives you a lot more, a lot of additional tools as well.
How long are you doing this?
Oh, okay. So I first started working on Star Wars material in 2006. And it hasn't been constant, but yes, my first project was BioWare's Star Wars The Old Republic video game. They hired me as a writer. I did not know it was a Star Wars game at the time. They hired me for just whatever they had. It turned out to be a Star Wars game, and I've been doing Star Wars stuff pretty steadily ever since for the last 11 years, and now I feel really old.
Will there ever be a Sandbox game with the Star Wars theme? So will there ever be a Star Wars Sandbox game, maybe in production? A lot of Sandbox game offer the player to create their own story within that universe, and I, as a gamer, love to see that in games, like something that I have created on my own, shaped maybe the galaxy the way I want it to.
So it's an interest. So I am not speaking with any, I don't know what games are in development right now, but I can speak generally to that. I think the closest thing we've ever seen to that was probably Star Wars Galaxies, the multiplayer game. And one of the struggles with that game was that the broader the experience, the harder it is to evoke some of the sort of intimate family-type relationships and some of the epic stakes that some of the core themes to the franchise. The broader you build a game, the harder it is to hit home with those. So I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is how to create a sandbox game that actually ends up feeling like Star Wars in more than just the scenery. You would have to be very clever to do that. And hopefully someone will someday, because it's a cool idea. Like, I would play that game if it could be good.
What do you think about Episode 7 and all that idea of remaking the original trilogy? Because even Mark Hamilton is laughing to that.
It's an interesting question. I mean, for me, I think clearly it echoes those original movies, and especially A New Hope, pretty clearly. On the other hand, it's also bringing new aspects into it, right? Like, Luke is not a mystery the way Rey is a mystery. So it's not as direct as I think some people make it out to be. For me, as someone who has been deeply immersed in Star Wars for, the last 11 years, certainly, and then, of course, my entire life just as a fan, for me, yes, I look at it and go, well, but I feel like I've seen that stuff before. But I don't think that's going to be true of people who, have just seen the original movies and haven't watched a Star Wars story for decades and haven't read 200 Star Wars novels. So I think how it ends up feeling depends a lot on who you are and what your experience with Star Wars has been, as to whether it's, wow, this is fresh and new but still Star Wars, or, well, I've seen a lot of this before. That is my kind of rambly answer to that. Yeah. I know everyone has their own opinion on that one, and I think it's interesting to see people fight that one out, honestly.
Okay, I have another question. I want to ask you about hero growth. So all these heroic novels and stories are like from zero to hero. And if you watch some other heroic stories like Harry Potter or The Hobbit or something, you always have this small, insignificant hero who is usually without parents and without guidance, and then he meets a mentor and he gets an item of power, and his path is always long and difficult. It is always difficult to get to being a hero from zero. And maybe lately we have seen some deviation from that practice, and I think a lot of criticism to some new movies basically are about that. For example, in this new Star Wars, the female Jedi character, she's like a Jedi from, oh yeah, I have 2 more hours to become a Jedi, and she's suddenly a Jedi and does all powers, etc. But what I want to know is, how important do you think that this gradual growth and these elements, a mentor, an item of power, and or a symbol of power, and I forgot what's the third thing. Oh yeah, being a hero in the beginning. How do you think it's important building a hero and connecting the audience to the hero?
I'm going to cheat on my answer to this a little. I think it is only important. It is only important so far as it works, right? It's not inherently important. If those elements are what you are using to make a good story, then you need those elements. If you don't use those elements and you still make a good story, then great. Now, obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. So in practice, this touches a little bit on what I was saying about Force Awakens, in that it depends on your audience, and it depends how familiar with that kind of arc of a story the audience is. Is this an audience that has gotten way too familiar with the hero's journey and seen it 1,000 times and wants something a little different, or wants a little bit of a tweak on the old formula? They might be bored by something that is just absolutely traditionalist. On the other hand, if you've got an audience that, you know, is experiencing this stuff for the first time or the second time, they might just want to see it done really, really well. I think with Star Wars in particular, you do need to be careful about going too far away from the sort of hero's journey structure, because again, it's one of those things that people almost expect from the franchise at this point. So anytime you deviate from that, you need to be asking yourself, okay, if I'm losing this, does it still feel Star Wars? Am I bringing in enough other pieces that feel Star Wars that I'm not just telling a different kind of story altogether?
What parts of the expanded universe would you like to see brought back into canon? Would it be something a bit smaller, like just characters, maybe Darth Bane, or something a bit crazier, like Yuuzhan Vong, Invasion?
So, my feeling on bringing back the expanded universe stuff, I mean, I love a lot of that stuff. I wrote some of that stuff. But I also feel if those stories were good, they're still good. Like, I can still go back and reread them, and they're still great. So when it comes to bringing some of that back, what interests me most is ideas that you can build new stories around. So I absolutely want to see new Old Republic stories in the new canon, but I'm okay if that Old Republic looks a little different than it used to. There are planets that I think were very cool, or alien species that I think were great from the expanded universe, and I'm always happy to see them, you know, rebuilt, because now we can tell new stories with them. But I think it's a mistake to try to just retell the old stories that were done right the first time. We've still got them. We don't need to see them. We don't need to see someone trying to do them again. So anything that gets brought back, for me, I want to see used as a building block in some way. It needs to add to the foundation of the universe. Anyone else?
I know you are not director or producer, but I want to hear your opinion. I'm a fan of Star Wars from 1977. I'm pretty older than you. What is the reason of huge difference between some movies of Star Wars? For example, the third or fourth part is movies almost for kindergarten children, and sixth is for intellectual discussion. What is the reason? Because sometimes I was really, really surprised.
I think a lot of that has to do with the particular goals that George Lucas had. So again, this is wild speculation on my part, but I'm going to speculate anyway. So I think for George Lucas, Star Wars was a great place to tell whatever story he wanted to tell at the time. And sometimes he wanted to tell dark, complicated intellectual stories, and sometimes he wanted to tell stories for his own kids. And I think he let himself do that because it was his and no one could tell him no. I kind of admire that. It does lead to some of the lack of consistency that you're talking about. But I think that's one of the benefits and the pitfalls of having a franchise so identified with one person that, you know, when that person feels one way, you get something very different than when that person feels another way. And I think now that George Lucas is no longer involved with the franchise, we may see more consistency, but I think we'll probably end up seeing potentially less risk as well. So we'll see how it goes. That's the best I can answer without being inside George Lucas's brain.
Okay, this one is basically for you as a writer, because I read every novelization and I watched every movie except your Rogue One. So I'm interested to because I noticed differences between books and novelizations. So, as a writer, did you have a problem novelizing the script? How does that process go? Do you receive a script or see a movie in a rough cut or something? How do you write a novelization? And how much freedom do you have in character development and some tweaks in the story? Do you have any freedom at all?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. So let me talk about the process a little first, and then I'll get to the second part of your question. So the way Rogue One happened for me is they brought me out to the Lucasfilm offices in San Francisco, and I got to read the script. And I didn't see the whole movie because the movie was not finished at the time, but I got to see some little clips to sort of give me a sense of how those characters were being acted. I went home, they gave me a copy of the script to have. They would send me a lot of photo references from the set so that I could look at, you know, okay, so what does Jedi actually look like? What is this random, you know, alien in the background look like if I'm going to describe him? They were incredibly good about giving me all of that material to work from. But I did not see the finished movie until the day it came out, at which point I spent the entire movie watching it and going, oh, did I get that right? I got that right. Oh, I got that wrong. Oh, I got that right. In terms of the creative freedom and sort of the process that I took, Lucasfilm was very generous in the amount of freedom that they were willing to give me. There were very few things that I did in the novelization where I got a note back saying, no, you're expanding too far beyond the film. What I tried to do is I wanted to make sure that the novelization felt like it justified its own existence, that it did things in a book that only a book could do and that the film couldn't do. So I didn't want to make up entirely new plot lines, but I did want to deepen everything that was there as much as I could. So I would add new scenes, but I would also, double the length of other scenes in order to really sort of dig deeper into what was going on. I spent a lot of time getting into the emotions of the characters and exploring, what is Jin feeling at this particular point in the story? How is all the trauma affecting her? It was a really interesting challenge for me because I had never done a novelization before. So looking at the screenplay and the stills and going, okay, how do I make this into a novel that is going to feel true to the movie but still worth reading on its own? That was hard, and it's up to readers to tell me whether or not I was successful at that. But yeah, it was. Let me know when you do. Anyone else?
Any other questions? If there's no more questions, if someone has some book signings or something, we could all go to the VIP room and talk to the author and get an autogram or something. And
Yeah, feel free to come along and chat and sign and whatever y'all want. Thank you.